for today's webinar, Succession Planning, 5 Basic Steps. Our presenter today is Joshua Smith. Joshua is a Principal Human Resources Consultant here at CPS HR Consulting. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few pieces of information about the webinar. To avoid interruptions to the presentation, all attendees are in listen-only mode. You can still ask questions, and we encourage you to do so using the Q&A box in the webinar dashboard. We'll make every effort to address your questions at the end of the presentation as time allows. Today's presentation is available on the CPS HR Consulting website. We've also made the slide deck available as a handout for this webinar. You can download it from the Handouts tab in your webinar panel. We will forward a link to all of our attendees once today's recording is available for viewing. And now I'll turn the presentation over to Joshua.
Thank you, Julie. I appreciate that introduction. And hello, everybody. I'm so glad you're here with us today discussing succession planning. I know it's a really big beast to tackle. I've been doing succession planning for several years now. We do succession planning consulting here with CPS HR Consulting. And all of our clients, of course, are government or public sector agencies. And I myself have worked as an HR director for many years for 2 different municipalities here in the state of Texas. So, and judging by the people on the webinar who are registered for this webinar, I can tell it remains a really important and possibly urgent issue in our agencies. Hopefully this webinar will provide a foundation for how you proceed forward into managing succession with your organization. So from a 30,000-foot view, these are the topics we're going to be covering over the next 45 minutes or so. So what is succession planning and why it actually does matter to the survival of your organization? We're going to be talking about the aging workforce. And I know we're a little sick of hearing about the aging workforce, but it is a reality. However, we will cover this briefly. We will discuss some of the obstacles to succession planning, which are many, but important to be aware of so we can recognize the obstacles and plan around them. And finally, we have an actionable 5-step process to succession planning, which we developed at CPS HR. We have also developed a 40-page toolkit with about a dozen or 24 toolkit tools in the toolkit to assist in the development of a succession plan, which can be customized to any organization. So the 5-step process and the toolkit is not really intended to be prescriptive. Not all the tools are intended to be used, only those where the organization needs help. So we use the tools within this toolkit not only with our own clients with CPS HR, but also internally with our own Emerging Leaders program. What we're going to do is we're going to start with a poll. I want to learn a little bit more about you and your current succession plans. So Julie, I'm going to go ahead and kick off that first poll to you to facilitate.
Okay, so our first poll has been launched. You've got 4 options to select from. Please select only one. And the question is, please tell us about your organization's current succession plans. So, I'm seeing answers coming in very quickly. And I see 2. Well, it looks like we've got close results for the top 2 and the bottom 2, actually. So keep on answering. We'll let this stay open for just a few more seconds while the last few responses come in, and then we will share our results. And I think we are there. Okay, I'm going to close the poll, and let's share results. Okay, so the top response is we have no plan to implement a succession plan. That came in with 35% of the responses. Next in line was we plan to implement in the next 6 to 12 months. That one had 31% of the votes. The next one comes in with plans to implement in the next 13 to 36 months. That was 19%. And finally, at 15%, people voted that they currently have a succession plan in place. So yeah, 15% already do have a succession plan.
Okay. Well, that's really good to know. And maybe they're just checking to see or validating, hey, is what we're doing right? Or, you know, where else can we look to see how we can improve? It's good to see that most of you are either there or in the planning stages. About a third of you have no plan for implementing a succession plan, which is fine. It may not be for you for whatever reason, but succession planning definitely has its place in the organization. It's not the easiest thing to handle, but we're going to show you some areas where you can implement something that's effective for you.
Okay, so closing up those results, and it's back to the slide deck, Josh.
Thank you, ma'am. So we're going to look at what is succession planning. Now, there was a good question that was asked prior to the webinar, which is what's the difference between succession planning and workforce planning? So although they both have the same goal of putting the right people and the right jobs at the right time, workforce planning is mostly budget driven and focused on staff level jobs, hiring forecasts, internal resource needs for the future. It also focuses on things like understanding how changes will impact job requirements and costs, understanding labor market demographics, workforce readiness, training needs, recruitment, onboarding plans, etc. Where succession planning is more of an approach to professional development with the really express purpose of identifying agency critical workforce talent. So often some level leadership, management, or essential technician, professional, or top performers. However, it's not always about and not only about positions. The true focus is on the competencies held by positions within the organization. And furthermore, succession is not just about developing people for leadership positions. It's important to focus on competencies within positions that drive your organization. And that's one thing you'll have to ask yourself is, what is really propelling our organization forward and what positions help us get there? Preserving and managing knowledge is also essential to the organization. So when people with high levels of knowledge, skills, ability, and experience leave the organization, all of those things they possess leave with them. And we know that all too well. We have to find ways to capture and utilize their knowledge while they're still with us in the organization. I know sometimes we tend to think that, oh, well, Joe's been here for 20 years, he's never going to leave. When the fact of the matter is, and we all need to have that realization, is everybody leaves in some way, shape, or form. And sometimes it comes more all of a sudden and we didn't expect it, whether it's somebody was injured or something with the family or somebody passes away, or they could just up and leave. There are those people that just kind of walk out of a job. Finally, succession planning is about protecting your organization from losing productivity or worse, major initiatives falling through the cracks because a key person in the organization with key institutional knowledge left without dispensing that knowledge to anybody. And meanwhile, the organization didn't prepare for anyone within the organization with the necessary knowledge or skills to step up and keep critical pieces of the organization at least afloat. So we're going to talk about also what succession planning is not. It is not pre-selection. This is where managers or decision makers have an idea of who they want to select before any selection process begins. Obviously, this is not a fair way to plan succession. In addition, it's most likely illegal, especially in union or civil service environments. At the very least, it's a poor business practice. So we need to make sure that we're as inclusive as possible to where those that have the skills and or we can help develop those skills, they're ready to participate in the near to mid future. A promise of promotion is also what succession planning is not. Succession planning is an opportunity for employees to develop and cross-develop in other areas of the organization. So those selected will have the opportunity to gain new skills and competencies, but it is not an indicator of who will be promoted. So those of you in HR all know this all too well, that these are one of the things that we should never promise. In fact, we in HR have an acronym for this, TIPS, T-I-P-S. We should never threaten, intimidate, or promise. Let's talk about drivers to succession planning. What are your drivers to succession planning? In other words, what is leading you to institute succession planning? What do you want as a result of your succession planning efforts? Those of you online probably have some similar drivers to deliver succession planning to your organization, and whatever your goals are. Here's what we do know that effective succession planning can provide. So number one, it can ensure that you have talent to deliver quality service. Well, how? Well, because you know that you have continuity in knowledge, skill, ability in your organization through bench strength you're developing. It provides a vehicle for transferring critical knowledge. Succession plan helps identify potential talent. It leads to a committed work environment. Well, what do I mean by a committed work environment? So those who we develop are more engaged. That's just part of the data that we've seen. They see the line of sight between where they currently are and where they aspire to be in the organization. They want to be promoted, they want to be engaged, and they want to provide something to the organization. Employees are also bolstered by knowing that they have a team around them filled with competent individuals to pick up the slack left by the person who is left there. Therefore, morale tends to be higher in competent, cross-developed organizations. Because what happens when people leave is that the work that they have seems to get dispensed to everybody else, and that leads to a tired workforce. It enhances overall organizational effectiveness. This is what I mean by the continuity of the organization. And productivity doesn't seem to be as negatively affected when key people leave. There also is a lower cost in time and external recruitment efforts. So there are always managers out there that say, well, we can always go and find somebody else. Well, that's not really the case, especially for some of these positions that have high levels of acumen. Government agencies in many respects serve as business units with high level of technical expertise. This is becoming difficult to find. Any of you who have tried looking for a good engineer or compensation manager, IT director, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If our agencies can develop and cross-develop effectively internally, then the urgency to find someone outside the organization will be lessened. Plus, it'll make those elected officials happier because we're developing people from within. I'm sure there are those out there who have elected officials say, well, why can't we hire from within? Why are we hiring from outside all the time? So what I want to hear from you are obstacles to succession planning. If those of you that are doing it or thinking about doing it, what are your obstacles? We have the data from thousands of public organizations, and we think we have the answers to the obstacles preventing agencies from developing their leaders. So I'd like to take a chance to learn from you and your experiences. So with that, Julie, I'll go to you to facilitate the second poll.
Okay, here we go. The second poll is now live. Please select one answer. And the question is, what is your biggest challenge in developing future leaders? You can choose from not enough time or prioritization, lack of organizational expertise, or it's just too hard. Our organization is too small. It's not a priority due to other initiatives or others. So, seeing some good responses coming in. I'm also seeing a clear leader in this one. So we'll leave this poll open for maybe another 10 seconds while those last responses coming in very quickly, and then we will go ahead and share the results. And just another second or two, and we'll close this up. Okay, looks like we have all of our responses. I'm closing the poll and sharing the results. Okay, actually, the results came in a little bit closer than initially thought. The leading answer was not enough time or prioritization. That came in at 33%. At 31%, we have not a priority due to other initiatives. The next highest answer was our organization is too small. And that was 13%. 12% was just simply others, the big catch-all. And the lowest response rate was 11% at lack of organizational expertise, or it's just too hard.
Okay, Julie, thank you very much for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
And we will go back to
slide deck.
Thank you very much. So what many of you expressed in the poll is what we've found through thousands of other government agencies throughout the country. And we have surveyed them, we've talked to them, and what we're hearing is not, what you're telling us is not unindicative of what we're hearing from out there in the market, the rest of the country. So what we'll see is the challenges. There's lots of excuses offered besides dog ate my homework, but the private sector, by the way, they don't do any better than we do at this. In fact, two out of three succession planning initiatives usually fizzle out after about 2 or 3 years. So developing leaders isn't always easy. It takes a custom approach to each individual and organization. It takes time, it takes planning and effort. And so in our research, this is the list. This list is the most cited for leadership development issues and why they aren't practiced. So a lot of you said it's the day-to-day stuff. We're putting out fires. We have too many other priorities that are going on. We just don't have time for this. It was interesting that time and prioritization, or maybe it was what was down on the list. I think it was the expertise, or it was too hard. So it sounds like there is some level of expertise within the organization. It's just there's other things going on that take precedent. And by the way, when we talk to organizations and we say, when do you plan to have something in place? If you're going to put a succession plan in place, a lot of them say 2 to 3 years, and we ask 2 to 3 years later, and it's still 2 to 3 years, 2 to 3 years. So it just really keeps getting put on the back burner. And the workforce is definitely changing. 60% of the government workers are eligible to retire this year. This is due to the fact that 10,000 baby boomers are turning 65 every single day, which we keep hearing about silver tsunami and have for almost a decade, and I think everybody's sick of hearing it. I know we're tired about hearing it, but the thing is, it is impactful. It's just not as impactful as we thought it was, at least not at first. Well, why is this? That's because the housing bubble, obviously delayed retirements, people are living longer, people still want to be productive in the workforce. But we're still looking at 2020 that half the workforce by that time will be made up of millennials. And according to a survey conducted by SHRM, the number one worry among employers was that they wouldn't be able to find the people they need to fill the open positions. It's not to say there's not enough people to fill jobs. It's not an issue of enough people or bodies. It's the issue of not having enough of the right people with the right skills to fill those jobs that require a specific set of knowledge and skills. And so to give a little more context about the changing demographics, this is the current makeup of the workforce. As you can see, the public sector's workforce is slightly older. Therefore, the pressure is on us to make sure we develop our workforce quickly and strategically. And as fate would have it, those of us who are not millennials actually have quite a bit in common with incoming generation in terms of what we expect from our employers. We all want purpose to make a difference. We want that responsibility to contribute. We want that autonomy, how we work, freedom to work, when and where we work. We all want that. We want attention too. We want that level of feedback from input and opportunities from our employers. And this hasn't changed in 20 or 30 years. You know, that the main drivers to work isn't money. It's these other type of intrinsic values. People come into a job for extrinsic purposes, maybe for benefits. And although they do look at reputation, especially this generation, they want to feel like they make a difference. They want to work for someone who has a mission instead of for someone who makes widgets. And believe me, high potential job seekers talk, and they are well connected about which employers to work for and which ones to not work for. But when it comes to staying, they stay for all the reasons listed. And we do too. And compensation, although important, doesn't usually land in the top 5. And if anybody wants to know what the number one reason people leave their job, it's not surprising, it's their boss. And again, we're not going to compete with the private sector on a compensation extrinsic level, probably. So we have to be creative in how we recruit and how we operate as an organization. And so if you can name the organizations in your respective state who you deem as top employers, I'm sure you could think of that. You don't have to say them, but you know who they are, and you're thinking about them. So why are they special? What makes them good? What makes them, want to work for these organizations? So what I've done is just kind of create this is from an actual organization that I worked with, a public agency, kind of what it looked like a few years ago. And you can see these are all the dates for when they came on into their respective into this organization, and then just 3 years later. I don't know if this looks familiar to anybody, but I'm not trying to scare you, but this is actually a reality. And finding people with these skill sets is becoming in some cases very hard. For us, for me, sometimes trying to find a compensation manager, that is nothing short of a miracle if we find somebody that is a good compensation manager. So even the dark side has a succession plan. It's not the good kind of succession management, but they do something. Obviously, not all of what they do is constructive. They put all resources into one basket or person, which is not good because it resembles pre-selection. There's no EEOC compliance. Not everyone is given a chance. There is not an apprentice academy like there is on the light side of the force. Again, this is more pre-selection. Also, information is not always transparent. They don't want to share too much for fear the apprentice will overthrow them. Well, what you were kidding, they always are. And the master will fire the apprentice if someone better comes along. So there's zero trust. This is ruled by fear. But the apprentice does get a lot of hands-on experience and mentoring. So if the dark side can do it, no matter how dysfunctional, I think there is hope for all of us. There seems to be pockets of resurgence of leadership development. So what we'll show you is a 5-step actionable process for succession planning needs. These steps within the processes are not meant to be prescriptive. In fact, it's meant to be flexible and accommodating to your agency needs. Also, I'm not saying that every position or every person within your agency should have a succession plan. So, for example, some of you said you have such small organizations. Maybe you have a finance director, and the next step down is like a billing account manager. Or billing accounts person, and so the gap is just too big. And so obviously it is hard for some smaller organizations, but some of your departments or organizations may be too small, but that's not to say that you can't or shouldn't develop your talent, which we'll discuss later. So just because you don't have a succession plan per se doesn't mean you shouldn't have development plans for your employees. And so step one really of this 5-step model involves the identification of most critical positions in the agency that you're going to focus on and your efforts on during the succession planning period. And so the outcome of this is a list of positions selected by executives or sponsors, those key decision makers high up your executives, in which the agency will focus its efforts during the planning period. So what is a key position? So this is a position that's important regardless of the person who's in the chair, right? We're not just talking about the incumbent. So John may be great, but we're not talking about John. We're talking about his position. We all tend to value people, but we have to consider the position itself. So imagine what would happen if a football team didn't have a coach or a quarterback. So also a key position is vital to the support and operation of the organization. So for example, our own CEO told me once that if he had to choose a critical position for a succession, he would choose to develop a systems administrator, because so much of what we do and what we provide our customers is dependent upon our website functioning well. The third aspect is, and one of the important questions to ask is, what is the risk of not having someone in the position? What initiatives or tasks would fall if the incumbent were not there? And more bluntly, what is the risk of the current incumbent leaving? Much of this will be contingent on a few things. So what does the position possess that is critical to the operation of the organization? And what does the person possess that is critical to the operation? Relationships, we forget about that a lot. It's not just about knowledge, it's defining key players and partnerships. And who we deal with on a daily basis, who we have a good rapport with that kind of helps drive our business. Where are the landmines? Do we have anything documented? I know sometimes we're really fearful of documenting stuff. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. And so there are 4 phases to identifying these key positions, and we'll review them in greater detail. So the first phase ways is to gain leadership input and support for succession planning. It's so important to have that support from executive level to help review talent management strategies. What does the organization need to survive? Are there new programs or initiatives? What resources are required? Is succession planning going to really stymie a lot of those initiatives we have going on? What does your organization want to accomplish in the short and long term? Who are the main influencers? So we're not just talking about executives, but who are some of the players in the organization that really can create movement? Ask sponsors what they believe are the most critical positions or competencies, and not only for the organizations, but for the positions that you're talking about, and why. Seek input from diverse leadership about what a good program looks like, and maybe take a pulse of the organization through some surveys or focus group, especially as it pertains to leadership development. Succession Planning Oversight Committee would be phase 2. Now, the purpose is to have a team mentality in succession management. HR can't do this themselves. The key to any major initiative like succession planning is that they cannot rely solely on the shoulders of HR or it will fail. This is a cross-functional collaborative effort falling on the shoulders of leaders throughout the organization, not just HR. So the goals are for executive leadership and senior leadership. And so that's SPOC, again, Succession Planning Oversight Committee. Executive leadership and senior leadership who take ownership by promoting participation at senior leadership levels. You want to create and educate and create awareness. You want to help establish objectives and goals for the program. The Succession Planning Oversight Committee, or SPOC as I'll call it, they want to develop strategies consistent with the mission and values. They want to make sure you're streamlined in with them. Develop communication strategies. What are participants going to know about the program? What should they know? What should they expect? Oversee the progress of the program. What's kind of the status? How do we update or discuss this with executives about what's going on, and how does it filter into the overall workforce planning? And you may want to use them and other leaders, especially your executive seniors, to help establish and teach various curriculum. That would actually keep some of your costs down. We could talk about that in a little bit. So when we're identifying critical positions, look at the following. What are the organizational priorities and available resources? Not all positions require succession plan as stated before. That would be impossible. So begin with executive or senior leadership. Choose positions based on organizational priorities and gaps, and recall the story about my CEO and what position he would choose for succession, if you recall that story. Consider resources when selecting critical position. Is there a current incumbent who is knowledgeable or reliable? What activities are currently in play? And conduct an environmental analysis, maybe a SWOT or something, or talk about consumer demand, technology, growth projections, economic stability in the market, competitors, whatever that may be. So deciding which positions in succession plan is based on the following: the availability of key skill sets currently within your organization, availability of key skill sets currently in the market, and the impact of the position in a functional, political, economic, and other capacities, and the proximity of the current incumbent's retirement. You know, they expected to retire soon. And so we need to look at organizational priorities. How critical is the position to success? Does the success or failure of the individual position have a large impact on the organization's ability to meet its goals? And are the skills needed to succeed in the position common throughout the organization or even in the market? Would finding a replacement for this position require extensive training? So what I've done, and this is just an example of one of the tools that we have, 24 or so, is to look at identifying critical positions. And this just kind of walks you through it, assessing business strategies, business drivers, workforce implications, groups affected. So it kind of gives you a holistic, this is a forum to really facilitate discussion among executive leaders and those who would choose critical positions in your organization. Are there critical positions? How do they influence on achieving goals? Are they essential to meeting regulatory requirements or public safety? So those are all things that are going to be important. And a set of questions are asked about the position, such as existing bench strength for the position, likelihood of the incumbent leaving, turnover rates, for the position, geographic challenges, do you live kind of out in the desert, or is it hard to find people, and the degree of institutional knowledge. So a criticality score would generally be created, and you could talk about the imminence of retirement. This is not really, I know it looks scientific, but it's really just a facilitated discussion, and I'll give you an example. You won't see these slides. In fact, these slides aren't included in your slide deck. I just added them here so you can see an example. But this is what I do a lot in my training, or in the trainings or presentations that I give around the state of Texas in regard to succession planning. So I made up a public safety, or not a public safety, a public agency, gave kind of a background that was based on some of the organizations I've worked with in the past. What are their goals over the next 5 years? And then here are some critical positions to consider. But then I gave kind of real life personalities to some of these positions, about the HR director, how long they've been there, are they, vested, or how old are they? What does the council want, or what are the strategic plans coming up? So I did that with each of these positions. And then what I did is I got them in groups, and using that chart or that scale that I showed you, kind of have a measure, at least have that conversation about where they fall in terms of criticality, and as far as creating a succession plan for that particular position. So the phase 4 is really talking about competencies, which are a combination of skills, abilities, and knowledge needed to perform a specific task. It should be outcome focused and aligned strategically with organizational values and strategies. Succession planning leadership and owners should agree on what competencies they're looking for in future critical leaders. So organizations can begin by developing a competency library or utilizing a pre-existing library obtained from a reliable source. So some larger public sector agencies and HR professional websites have competency libraries that are posted and available for use, and they're free. So for example, the Office of Personnel Management, they have a competency library that you could look at to help develop your own competency library. CPS HR Consulting has also developed a succession planning competency dictionary, which contains a composite library of common organizational competencies to assist clients in developing their key organizational competencies. So key organizational competencies should align with business strategy, strategic planning, and overall success goals of the organization. And these can be grouped into 2 categories, business competencies and leadership competencies. And so once the organizational competencies have been established, focus should be placed on the requirements of the specific position being evaluated. Current incumbents and incumbent supervisors, subject matter experts should discuss the overall responsibilities of the position, the specific duties performed, the knowledge, skills, abilities, other characteristics required for success in the position. So using the information, subject matter experts should identify organizational competencies that are most applicable to the target position that you're looking at. And so once competencies have been identified for the position, SMEs should rank order them, not that you have to, but again, it's a good conversation piece, and we have tools to help you or assist you in this. And so this will help you determine the most critical competencies within your organization. I wouldn't choose more than 5 or 6 competencies in each category, talking about business or leadership. The goal is not to find a consensus among raters either. So if a consensus can't be reached, then consider averaging some of the rankings. So in order to develop a more scientific, robust, or thorough process, agencies should also consider conducting maybe a job analysis, just kind of looking again at some of the specific KSAOs of the particular job, especially as it's changing. Jobs change constantly, especially some of the high tech, whether it's engineering or IT professionals. So the next step is step 2. And again, everybody leaves. We talked about that. The question for the organization is when and how this happens. Many times it's impossible to predict, as we had said before. But when employees actually leave, even unexpectedly, organizations will be prepared for what to do next. And to maximize succession plan initiatives, it's important to identify critical employees through performance metrics and outputs. It's also important not just to ask who's ready now, but who may be ready in the next 3 to 5 years. Otherwise, organizations are depriving themselves of their diversity in their pool, their bench strength, if you will. So organizations will need to determine relevant competencies and experiences needed for the next step. So we're going to talk about experiences and why that's important here in a bit. So participants, when we're talking about identifying participants and the expected outcomes, they should be, participants are identified and invited to become members of the organization's talent pool. So this should be all inclusive. Everybody should be kind of invited. However, there's always going to be requirements, and they should know what that those are coming into them, coming into applying for this program. So there's a debate about whether or not high potential employees should know if they are high potential employees, but to us it's really clear that high potential employees should know they are high potentials. You're going to develop them, so they're going to want to know the purpose for their development, and they should know. And the expected outcome in this step is to invite all who are interested come forward. In doing so, there's many things to communicate. You have to communicate purpose. What is the timeline? How long are they going to be involved in this? What are the key positions that they're looking at or that they can vie for? What about qualifications? What do I need to do? Do I need to be with the agency for 3 years? Is it 5 years? What about as a supervisor? Do I have to be a supervisor to do this, or have supervisory experience, even if it's not in this organization? What is the selection process? How are you going to do this? What are some of the tools that are going to be used? What about the application information? When am I going to know if I'm accepted? How much time is it going to take for me to be involved in this? I'm already working 45 hours. Am I going to expect to devote another 10 hours a week outside of my regular work? I mean, so these are all valid questions and things that need to be worked out in the succession planning process and eventually communicated to those who would participate. So on a periodic basis, typically annually, agencies should do an internal assessment to determine the bench strength, which refers to capabilities, readiness of potential successors. So in order to assess current leadership bench strength, the SPOC team will need to obtain input from managers within your organization about potential of employees with whom they're familiar to assume specific critical leadership positions. They also should have an idea of who within the organization, if anybody, possesses the right mixture of competencies to successfully they can compete for and take the reins of leadership. So by using a key talent pool, your agency can increase the number of employees who will be prepared to step into a higher level of jobs. So the utilization of key talent pools is based on established competency-based criteria. It provides higher levels of confidence that are that the process of selecting succession planning candidates is fair, as opposed to simply asking managers who they believe by name. So we want to avoid the pre-selection part of this. So SPOC will need to take care in developing a plan for selecting high potential employees, and they should include two different areas for identifying people. First is potential. So for the purposes of this webcast and our toolkit, we're defining potential as readiness. You know, how long would it take for them to develop the necessary competencies to get to that next step? And so when we're talking about potential, of course, we have to talk about level of interest. They may not be interested at all. Some people are happy doing what they do. They want to check their brains at the door. They want to do their job, and they want to go home. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And a long time ago, I made a mistake when I was a young HR supervisor in the private sector of assuming that a person would take a line supervisory position. They had no interest in doing that at all. So that surprised me. But and the employee had no interest in moving up. Like I said, I had wasted my time and based future planning on an assumption. So interest can be obtained by having a simple application process. Your application can be embedded within various criteria suited for your needs. So for example, you can require minimum tenure, supervisory experience, licensure, certification requirements, etc. Whatever that is, whatever that looks like. Maybe it's a particular skill. Now this next thing that you see, I don't know if this looks familiar. This is a 9-box grid. Again, it's not meant to be scientific, although we are making strides to make it a little bit more scientific. But as I explained kind of the potential to you earlier, the performance side is really talking about how are they performing now? And I know that not everybody's performance management systems may be up to date, or maybe they're not confident in them. It could just be something that is, well, Are they performing the standard or at least at a satisfactory level in the last couple of years? Have they been through any kind of disciplinary hearings or anything like that? So you can at least look at performance from a little bit minimalistically, like I just said. But what we want to look for are those growth employees, future leaders, and high impact performance people. Those are in the top right-hand corner. So your growth employees are those that are in the talent pool who may not have achieved in performance what they reveal in potential. Those future leaders are people in your organization who are realizing their full potential while at the same time performing at their peak. And so this is kind of the dream team. And then you have your high impact performance players, and this is a group that shows some potential for having a greater impact. And it's often a matter of readiness that prevents them from moving to the larger roles. Generally speaking, from experience, after you look at the gaps, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the gaps that we see in assessing in performance, or I'm sorry, in potential. So as we kind of assess those competencies now and what they look like, as we look at the gaps and say, well, how long will it take to fill those gaps? If it's longer than 3 years, then generally speaking, they're probably not ready for succession planning yet. But again, that's not to say that they can't be developed in other areas that will help them get there. So, and the third step is preparation and getting people there. So it really is just about being transparent. The incoming participants need to understand, again, what are the purpose, goals of the program, what are the demands, expectations of the program, including pre-work. Are there any books that they're going to have to read, any classes maybe that they need to attend, whether external or internal, and they need to have a general understanding of what the succession planning is and what it is not. So when we look at the phases of this part is communicating expectations. This is the most difficult piece that you are going to come across. And just like any other communication platform that you guys have had in the past, it's all about how you communicate things. How long is the program? What will I be doing? Will I have a mentor? How much time will be required of me to devote to develop outside of regular hours? Is anyone going to cover some of my day-to-day duties? Will I have a mentor or a coach? How long is the program? So these are all relevant questions. So communicating resources for development, consider posting your succession planning competency dictionaries on your intranet or online or somewhere where it's accessible to employees. Communicate to your employees the fact that this resource is available, and also the list of professional development options. So as you start to create a track for development options, do it by posting it on the intranet or somewhere that they can see it that's visible, and as well as a training resource list, again, whether it's external or internal. So for example, Michigan Department of HR intranet includes a website where employees can click on any one of the competencies in the agency competency library to find out the learning resources associated with that competency. Where can they go? What is it? Keep current job descriptions, classifications in a shared file. Make that available for succession planning as well. And once the succession planning plan is organized, post a list of requirements for participating in the program, such as commitment timeline window, types or examples of assignments, such as job rotations and potential for external development and assignments outside of the regular scope of work. And create communication schedules and execute. Make sure they know what's coming and when it's coming. Phase 2 is more of the communication schedule, or I'm sorry, diagnosing the strengths and developmental needs. So 360 assessments, they're not actually that cheap, but what you can do is once participants are selected, is that you need to make sure that they have an opportunity to know what their gaps are. And so you can ask, and those of you who are familiar with 360, it's simply, not simple, but it's asking managers, cohorts, subordinates, kind of for their input on your various competencies. This is not intended to be a performance management exercise. There's a lot of people that mistake 360 for, hey, we're now measuring your performance as is, and this is not an evaluation. And so we just need to make sure of that. Also, a development plan. So once we understand what those competency gaps are, using that to create the development plan, having coaches that can kind of help those participants in that process to hone up on their skills to where that they can perform them independently, where they can perform them competently without much monitoring over time. Now, knowledge management is going to be extremely important, where we need to capture and document and access knowledge. I mean, knowledge management is it's not studied much in the public sector, but in the private sector, knowledge management is studied at the CEO level. But knowledge management is strategies and processes designed to capture core knowledge to enhance performance and competitiveness. So it's based on two critical activities. Number one is you got to capture and document an individual's knowledge. We have what's called a breadcrumbs exercise, where it's like, what are kind of your daily duties? Who do you interact with? Like, who are your key partners? Those types of things, because you don't want a proverbial, somebody got hit by a beer truck, which can happen. And then you have no idea. You have nothing to go off of in terms of where the person left their work. And two, it's dissemination within the organization. So I get it, we don't like to share, and depending on our organizational structure, maybe job knowledge gives us a sense of some kind of false sense of job protection. I had a public agency director where I worked at one time, and he kept bragging, well, this place is going to go to hell when I leave. And I was like, really? Is that? You don't want to, and it's because you're not sharing your knowledge. Is that really kind of the legacy you want to leave? This place is going to go to the crapper when you leave? I don't think that's what you want. And so we have to collaborate using leadership development tactics, whether it's shadowing, cross-development, coaching. We have to hold leaders accountable through performance management. Make it an item or a task on their performance that says they are instructed to coach, or they are instructed to mentor somebody effectively. And so we have to hold people accountable. We always talk about holding people accountable. That includes our leaders. And so I think these types of things will help develop a culture of knowledge sharing. And it's important. We should tackle knowledge management to address knowledge attrition, because that's what's happening. Knowledge goes out the door, and knowledge management directly is tied to leadership preparation. A Swedish study highlighted a gap pertaining to a link between succession planning and knowledge management to cope with the danger of knowledge attrition. And as a result, the federal government in Sweden enlisted this knowledge management initiative where they instituted things like phased retirements or retirement job bank, where people could always come back on an interim basis. They had emeritus programs. They had part-time retired annuitants that could still work part-time. Or they had mentoring programs where retirees would come back and mentor current incumbents, or there were knowledge sharing forums. So these things, as you can see, some of the sticky tabs that you see on the screen, Texas Instruments saved a lot of money and increased capacity. Accenture, they lowered their costs, shortened delivery times. So obtaining that knowledge is really key. Future leadership development is not replacement planning. At any given time during the year, an individual occupying one of an organization's key positions may leave for any number of reasons. And so at that point, the normal process is to begin a recruiting process to replace that individual. So if an organization has a successful leadership development program in place, the odds are that these critical positions will be filled by an internal candidate, and that they've been mindfully developed to fill these key roles instead of relying solely on external hires. Again, elected officials come back saying, why don't we develop people from within? And we don't want people to be left in limbo. This is further exacerbation when we start to cut training, which for some reason seems to be one of the first things to go in budget cuts. We have a reliance on this external hiring. Employers hire external where they believe competencies within the organization don't exist, but when they don't help employees develop competencies, a cycle is created where the employer is relying on the external hires. The employers are relying on external hires for mid-level and executive jobs because competencies necessary for the position don't exist internally, or at least they think it doesn't. And meanwhile, they're not cultivating those competencies internally, giving existing employees a chance to compete for these positions. And so it creates these feelings of disloyalty, resentment. You know, they don't care about me. And think about it, when we don't develop our staff and when we have to go outside to find talent because we don't develop the current staff, what message are we sending? That, you know, hey, my employer doesn't care about me. PwC commissioned a research study that carried out an online survey of about 4,000 graduates across 75 countries. This is about a year or so ago, and all were aged 31 and under, and were currently employed or about to start a new job. And when asked which benefits they would most likely value from an employer, they named, above and beyond anything else, training and development. Training and development was huge for them. And although we can concede that most of our employees receive some type of training and development, most of the training is not tied to future development as it relates to talent management or succession, but instead is tied to their current position. So in many ways, we implement what I like to call the inoculation approach, which is reactive. Okay, something's wrong or we need to address this in your current job, so we'll send you to a class. So one thing we have to ask ourselves is when someone has moved up in an organization, if we prepared them properly, everyone knows what the Peter principle is, but when someone gets moved up to a new position and they struggle, we have this fundamental attribution bias that they don't have the competence to perform the job, when more times than not, the truth is the employers have not helped them to develop the competencies or expertise that they need to be successful. So a person's first swim lesson should never be, hey, we're going to go out to the middle of the Pacific and cast you into the ocean. It's a sink or swim scenario. So the expected opportunities for development, it's all about, for development, it's all about outcome. So participants to work with peers and learn and collaborate in leadership-focused settings, cross-development projects, take leadership roles, individual-based opportunities linked to individual gaps to accelerate learning, envision a career path supported by mentors and peers. So group learning and that kinetic learning, that doing, that touching, that seeing, those are the things that really create opportunities to learn. The classroom just doesn't really do it that much. It has to be very engaging classroom, but this whole lecture type of training, it does not get in. Opportunities for participants to operate in work group, they help them, help those participants to obtain those KSAOs, lending to upward mobility, and they learn to work together in cross-functional teams. They learn to get out of those silos that we're so accustomed to sometimes in the public sector. The fundamental outcome of this development is action to close gaps between skills. We really need to do that. And what are and gaps that are going, gaps now, and possible, what does the job look like in the future and what gaps are going to look like then. An action plan or developmental plan will also provide a path that grows skills and expertise. Developmental resource can be found internal as well as external to the organization. Again, I know some of you have a lot of budgetary issues, but if we look to some of the skill sets within our organization, I think we'll find we have a lot of what we need already. And we should never, again, go back to that inoculation approach. So just looking at the development toolbox, there's all sorts of training out there, both internal and external. That OJT, the on-the-job training, job rotation, that stuff, job shadowing, that tends to work the best. Again, it gives that kind of realistic job preview, that hands-on kind of expertise. And finally, that loaned executive program, anybody that's curious about that, interesting situation a couple of years ago is that there was a city manager who left one city. They didn't actually feel like they had anybody internally to fill that position. There was an assistant city manager not too far away that needed that experience. So what they did is they had kind of a collaborative effort where the assistant city manager went over to the new city for 3 days a week. The new city paid him for that salary. The assistant city manager got that level of experience. They had an acting city manager, so it was like everybody won. So we have to create opportunities for rising stars or succession planning participants, rotate players to new assignments, letting others on the team show their stuff, develop their new skills, learn the new processes. Team will be a stronger fit. And so you got to anticipate mistakes too. We're really risk averse in the public sector especially. So we feel someone will put us on the chopping block if we make a mistake. And in fact, this is the best way to learn, is to get into the mix, take some chances. Of course, it has to be somewhat controlled, so we're not pressing an accidental red button or something, blowing something up. But we need to make sure that everybody is included or has a chance, and use those internal competencies. And again, get to that experiential development, because that is the best way to learn and experience through that rotation. And it really prevents that burnout that we see. So you're doing the same thing every day. Everybody likes to do different things. At least most people I know, they like to do different things every day. It just mixes stuff up. And I know, Julie, we're coming to a close here. So the final step is really just monitoring and making sure that we are looking at our program. Provide a record of individual progression. So do a retest of those, assess those skills again, those competencies after the learning has supposedly occurred. Has the gap closed? What does that look like? Survey folks, and you can survey leaders, coaches, mentors. You can even survey participants. How do they feel about the class? What about program effectiveness? How do we know we're being effective? Well, one measure of success for a successful succession program, I'm saying a lot of successes, would be the percentage of key positions filled outside versus internal candidates. Are there more applications internally than before? Are there action plans being completed? Number of days leadership jobs are open. Are those going down? So those are things and we have to seek input and share our progress with external leaders. So with that is the end. I don't know if I left enough for Q&A, but I think we can take a few, Julie.
Yes, we do have just a few minutes left, and we do have some questions that have come in, so let's just jump right in. First question is, why do so many organizations fail to use their own succession plan?
That's a really good question. I mean, you could ask that on almost anything. Why do organizations fail to use strategic planning? It happens, where you have something in writing, you put it in a desk, and you don't use it, and that just shows that it's not extremely well connected to your overall strategies or your workforce planning. So it needs to really be in the front view. So that way, even if people turn over, they can refer to it as a guide and say, this is how we're supposed to move forward with our succession planning, and this is how we can take the wheel and utilize some of our internal resources.
Okay, terrific. Here's another one that asks if you can provide examples of organizations that have done succession planning particularly well, especially in government.
That's a really good question. I mean, obviously, we've done some consulting for organizations for succession planning. I can't tell you there are those that they've made vast improvements in their succession planning. There's not many that do it extremely well. I would look to probably just a couple you can probably contact, or maybe City of Plano, which is in Plano, Texas. They've had a succession planning program for 10 years or so. I think it's worked pretty well for them in the past. Another one is Brownsville Public Utility Board, which is near the Valley in Texas, near the south tip of Texas. So, but I haven't seen a lot that have just really risen to the top. It's tough, and like I said, a lot stop after the first 2 or 3 years.
Okay, thank you. So here's another one. Someone writes in, I am a first-line manager with a young, eager staff willing to do whatever I ask them to do. The problem is a middle manager who stifles growth. So how would you address that?
Yeah, I mean, that's more of a performance issue that becomes a middle manager issue. So, I mean, especially if you have a hungry staff ready for growth and those needs aren't being addressed, you could have potential attrition issues. But that becomes more of a performance management issue. And again, making it part of that manager's responsibility to develop and train their staff and be held accountable to that. That's really the best way from an HR standpoint. I would address that.
Okay, well, I tell you what, we are right at time now, and I don't want to keep people late. So I want to say thank you, Joshua, for a great presentation, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. Again, we will send a follow-up email that will have a link to the recording and a link to download the slide deck from today's presentation. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you, guys.